Do Se-hyun came to the store and started to pick out the items on the shelf, but he could only afford a Coke. Suddenly his phone rang, and he didn't want to pick it up because he would be asked for money all by himself. Clenching his hand into a fist, he barely restrained himself from being rude because he was sick of it. Finally, on the way home, Do Se-hyun got cold and realized that it was getting colder. The snow was falling under his feet, and all he could think about was how he couldn't let the water freeze. Suddenly, ahead of him, he saw a woman who was happy that her daughter was old enough and praised her for the snowman she had made with her own hands. He passed them, repeating to himself that the water should not freeze. When he got to his apartment, Do Se-hyun took his keys out of his pocket, nervous that he had been raised again. Rent, electricity, gas, and telephone. He walked inside and sighed heavily, hating that he had to worry about this. After that, he lay down on the bed without changing his clothes and realized that he wouldn't even wish such a life on his enemy. He was quite offended that, at his age, he still hadn't achieved anything. However, at that moment, his phone rang. Do Se-hyun despised those people who were trying to call him so hard, as he was ready to pay off his debts as soon as he received his salary. However, he froze in his tracks when he saw a message saying that the beta testing of the Elix game was completely over. Putting his feet down on the floor, he began to wonder if the official server was already open. He knelt down and began to actively search for something under the bed, stumbling upon a box. In it, he saw a disc of the very game that had changed his life so much in the past and had haunted him until now. However, as he rubbed his legs from the pain, he realized that it was probably not the right time for him to play such games. So he went to the trash can and threw it in the trash, emphasizing that he had already promised himself not to do so. He explained to himself that whether it was a game or the reality of the day didn't matter to him, and that it was all in the past. Suddenly, Do Se-hyun heard a strange noise. He turned around and noticed that his TV screen was hissing and showing interference. He was very worried that this equipment was going to break down, so he started shaking it, trying to fix it. At the same time, while the disc in the trash was vibrating and emitting a strange bright light, the guy was complaining that the repair would cost him as much as his monthly salary. However, his surprise knew no bounds when the disc turned on again and began to shine from the inside. Then a hand appeared from there and approached his face. All this continued for some time until he was completely drawn inside the screen, which was constantly glowing. The same thing happened to Jae-yong, who was sitting in a chair. They both heard a voice saying that the announcement of the official server of the game that no one else wanted to play in front of them. Paek Do-hyun was in the same situation. He was an office worker and was at his workplace. The fourth person who also disappeared from real life was Kwak Jong-han, who was sleeping sweetly in his bed. All of this happened after they logged into the official server of this game at the time when the message came that it had just opened. After that, all the rooms and offices they were in fell silent. They had no choice, so they immediately disappeared from reality. Elix is an empire-building game, a game where a character's class is determined by an ability test. The one that takes place at the first launch, encouraging you to develop your vassals and gain the trust of the Archduke. Participants had to explore dungeons, show all their skills, and build the perfect empire. The first person to meet the players was a man who just introduced himself and said his name was Bill Will. After making a bow, he explained that he was a guide in a game called Elix and was responsible for instruction. Bill Will said that they had been on a long and difficult path of beta testing and had finally opened the official server. He also expressed his hope that this time all players will get maximum pleasure. However, he advised not to forget about the most important thing, namely to be more careful. Therefore, he warned about the following. It turned out that if the king dies, the empire and all its vassals will cease to exist. Moreover, if the ruler was incompetent or lazy, the worst would happen. In this case, the Archduke would stage a coup d'etat and take away all his power forever. However, it was not as simple as it seemed, because death in the game meant death in real life. So he asked them once again to stay alive. Over and over again, new people were brought into the small wooden house, screaming and resisting. They tearfully begged to be released and spared. They also said that they really wanted to go home. Suddenly, Do Se-hyun was approached by a man with a blue complexion and asked why those gorillas were keeping them here. The man asked him his name. When he replied that his name was Kwak Jong-han, he explained that they needed to remove the village chief in order to strengthen their function. He also added that everyone present knew that the animal was sent with them to emphasize his powerlessness. However, Do Si-hyun noted that since the signs of his race had already manifested, he could make a deal with the chief. Kwak Yong-han began to panic. He sighed heavily and admitted that he hadn't finished the aptitude test, so now he had no one to turn to. The guy interrupted him and said that he was very similar to the young fisherman Sanpak Ho, who set sail at 5 in the morning. He smiled back at him and emphasized that he was a swimmer. Do Se-hyun said that now it was no surprise that he could see him on TV. Stretching their legs forward, they both marveled at being here together in this strange place. In fact, on the first day Do Se-hyun got here, after meeting with the leader Bill Will, all the players were leaving for the empires they had built. However, some of them had nowhere to go. For example, Kwak Jong-han's empire was destroyed during the beta test. So these players stuck with Kim Gap-young, who was good at this game, so they founded a small village trying to survive. However, one day the Archduke of the Kural tribe suddenly appeared, gathered his supporters, and made a coup. Kwak Yong-han said that this was the reason why he and several players were imprisoned. He was talking about Jae-yong, whom he met at the entrance, and Paik Do-hyun, players who escaped from reality. That's why the guy who had just started high school didn't return to his empire, but stayed here. The same story happened to Pak Do-hyun, an ordinary office worker, even though he also played the game for a while. Do Se-hyun closed his eyes and, given the above, began to think about what they should do now. He could not believe that the Archduke could not know about his king. It seemed impossible to him. Therefore, he was sure that he would return to his empire one day, either voluntarily or by force. Suddenly, he was approached by Jae-yong and told that he had a place to go, even though they could not do it now. Noticing the boy's puzzled expression, he added that as soon as the opportunity arose, they could live in his empire. He recalled how he had helped him when they first met and promised that he would also do everything for his normal stay here. Jae-yong pointed out to the boy that his race had not yet manifested itself. However, he knew very well that it was quite the opposite. Paik Do-hyun was of the same opinion, emphasizing that he was sure that Do Se-hyun was just keeping everything a secret. The man turned around and asked the boy if he was 1,000-faced, to which he asked if he was one of them. Suddenly, Jae-yong's eyes turned red, and the veins on his neck became visible. He asked Pak Do-hyun, calling him Glasses, if he had really spoken to him. Despite the fact that the man was sitting scared in the corner, he smiled and told him that he was still a good fit for the race. A smile appeared on his face as well, although he thought that such a compliment was rather dubious. In addition, he remembered that he had launched the characteristic fusion shortly before, thus changing everything himself. Suddenly, Jae-yong stood up, looked to the side, and asked him if he had heard anything strange. He replied that he hadn't noticed anything strange. After that, everyone in the room looked at the ceiling at the same time. Jae-yong couldn't take his eyes off the roof and assured him that there was definitely someone there, not inside but outside. He asked if what he was talking about was in the sky. However, when he realized that it was, it shocked him. Everyone around him started whispering to each other, wondering what it could mean. Do Se-hyun had his own version of the story, although he was not entirely sure that it was true. Kwak Yong-han also became nervous and asked the guy what the sound was and what was happening to the other people. They noticed that the whole tribe had gone outside and were trying to see what they were doing. The guy also decided to come closer and see what they wanted to see. Then he asked Kim Kap-jung what he thought about it. However, he was surprised and emphasized that no one was attacking them. He assured me that if it did happen that someone would come into this stupid village, those guys outside would definitely take care of it. So he advised us not to make a fuss. However, Du Si-hyun disagreed with him and said that everything seemed to be happening for a reason. He realized that something was about to happen. At the same second, the door opened. A huge monkey came inside and ordered all the people to go outside. However, they were in no hurry to do so. They felt it was safer inside and said they were hostages. Their hesitation was interrupted only by the words of a young man who emphasized that they had to go out, explaining that it could be many times more dangerous here than outside. But, to his surprise, no one reacted. Everyone continued to whisper and talk among themselves. Suddenly, everyone's attention was drawn to Kwok Jong-han, who silently stood up and headed for the exit. When the boy noticed this, he asked Jae-yong to follow him, and the latter, although hesitant at first, agreed. At first, they could hardly see anything, so they squinted their eyes. They were blinded by the bright sun, and in the distance, they could see a flying object. A few seconds later, an airship appeared in front of them. And not just one, but 4 of them. It was very strange for the boy because he did not believe that 4 ships would attack a small village. Although watching these objects, he also realized that, unfortunately, there was no other target nearby. Kim Kap-young started shouting that he had seen this before and said that it was an empire of deadly poisons. Du Si-hyun couldn't take his eyes off the airship and calmed down, because if it was really her, then her rating wasn't that high. Kwok Yong-han was confused, however, and began to ask him what happened and why they were attacking them. The guy explained that it was a common thing, at least in this game. Kim Kap-young added that these were not toys, and they should have prepared for this earlier. When empires get stronger, they start attacking not only dungeons, because they are all systematized in proportion to the number of players. Everyone is trying to make an alliance with the strong, so the empire's rating changes accordingly. The weak surrender to their mercy and become their slaves, saving their lives, because if they resist, everyone will die. At the same time, Autumn began to address them, saying that he was the king of the empire of deadly poisons from the race of snakes. He pointed a weapon at them and demanded that their leader surrender and hand over all the people, explaining that only then would everyone survive. In case of refusal, he promised to open fire. One of the monkeys began to shout that they were a majestic race of gorillas who never give up and fight fiercely. Kim Kap-young remarked that it looked ridiculous because they wouldn't be able to do anything with 4 airships with such low-grade guns. Du Se-hyun was very surprised by what was happening. He realized that even if conquering a weak empire was a common thing, it didn't explain why they were here. Besides, he remembered what he had said about people and realized that the king was really up to something. Jae-yong, in turn, was boiling with anger. His eyes were bloodshot and his voice became heavy and hoarse. The boy assumed that he might belong to the monster race, so he asked him to calm down and stay back. He knew that monsters were physically superior to any other race, but he realized that he had only recently become one. Hearing him crying behind him, Do Si-hyun realized that he couldn't even use basic skills yet. Therefore, he had only one thought in his mind about what they should do in this situation. Meanwhile, Autumn wondered at the fools around him and why they didn't give up. So, with a smile, he said that he would now have to kill them all. At the same time, the people on the ground felt intense heat from the fire, which was moving directly toward them. Everyone began to fall, burn, and die. Some begged for mercy, but it was all in vain. The guy watched the hell happening around him and realized that this could be the end of everything. He was saddened that in life and in the game, he could not change anything at all, so the only thing left was to die senselessly. However, when he squinted his eyes, he suddenly realized that he wanted to live and be saved no matter what. At the same time, a sign suddenly appeared in front of him, saying that the Defense Against Poison skill was activated. It turned out that this was the very first skill he had gotten, and was quite long awaited as it increased his characteristics. It was the same skill he had gotten to protect himself from vassals when he met a warrior who had no name. So the guy offered him a new one, in Cheon, which matched the man's beautiful silver-blue hair. So the game screen disappeared and a warrior appeared in front of him who looked exactly like the one he had named. When Do Se-hyun saw him, he immediately plunged into memories and even had tears in his eyes. At the same time, Otom started shouting that he was the Black Empire, not understanding what was happening and why Baekhyun was here. At the same second, the vassal snapped his fingers, after which very strange things began to happen. The airship exploded. The boy watched and could not believe that the Archduke did not really know about his king. Finally, he began to clutch his shirt, whispering that he was finished now, because he was most afraid that he would come alone. The figure of a very handsome man with wings appeared before him. His name was Ruhak, and he was well acquainted with Do Se-hyun. Some time after the battle, only the wreckage of the ship and smoke could be seen around. In addition, in the distance, there was a barely alive Autumn. At the same time, Paek Do-hyun returned to the men. They were surprised because they thought the man was definitely dead. He held his head and said that they must have died. After that, he said that he was fine. And then, adjusting his glasses, he asked the guy if he knew what sins they had committed to bring them all this happiness. Do Se-hyun vaguely began to make excuses that he didn't know anything. In response, he just said that he was not good at lying at all. Paek Do-hyun noticed that he was looking at the man with the huge wings so tenderly, as if he was dying of love. Suddenly, the man grabbed his hands, trying to ask him why his reaction was so strange and who he was. However, he was puzzled when a sharp saber appeared right next to his neck, which immediately stopped his questioning. In Cheon ordered him to take his hands away from Do Se-hyun. He assured him that he understood, and then slowly let him go. The embarrassed boy was pleasantly surprised and wanted to touch Ruhak, saying his name. However, he was furious and said that even though he didn't know what he was doing in this place, he wanted him to stop. Do Se-hyun noticed that the man had shown up at a strange time, so he asked him if he had been waiting for him. Ruhak replied that this was impossible. He also said that there was no archduke who wanted to see his king in danger. After that, he grabbed him by the chin and emphasized that, unfortunately, only their king carefully hides the signs of his race. Jae-yong and Kwak Jong-han could not believe their ears when they heard what the Archduke had just said. He continued to squeeze the boy's neck, trying to show his true nature. Do Se-hyun resisted and asked him to stop. However, in a few seconds, feathers began to appear through his shirt, turning into huge wings. Although he had tears in his eyes and his heart was aching because he didn't want anyone to know about it, everything became clear. His new friends were shocked to see this, so they couldn't say a word as they watched the transformation. Paek Do-hyun alone was calm, confirming his guess that the guy was indeed from the celestial race, namely the one who was the master of Baekhyun, a power that he had won with his own hands from the entire empire, the king who had raised it to the top of the rankings from the very bottom, and who had been ranked first himself. Ruhak grabbed Do Se-hyun's hand, although he was still resisting, and began to ask him why he had abandoned the empire and hid in such a place with the people. When Jae-yong heard this, he was so overwhelmed with emotion that the men next to him could barely contain their resentment. At the same time, he smiled and said to the Archduke that he did not believe that he knew nothing. So the man proposed to kill each of these people, one by one, in order to make him answer. However, Do Se-hyun started screaming and ordered not to touch them under any circumstances and not to kill anyone. The Archduke emphasized that he must understand that he would have to do this in any case. But he said that he needed them and reminded him that the Archduke's duties included following the king's orders. So he asked to accept the surrender of the king of the Poison Empire and take him into custody. After that, he ordered to ensure the safety of the people behind him and ordered them not to do anything without his order. In addition, he told him not to forget that there was a king of the monster race among them and asked him to keep this in mind. At the same time, Do Se-hyun began to feel strange sensations in his body. At first, he thought that this weakness and dizziness was due to the wings, but it wasn't. At the same time, Ruhak wanted to contradict him and asked him what would happen if he didn't listen to him. So he replied that he would not watch it in silence. Do Se-hyun wanted to be steadfast, but his eyes began to blur and he felt very sick. After that, he started to fall. Fortunately, Ruhak supported him, asking him what he meant. Do Se-hyun recalled the time when he was lying on the floor and, with a trembling voice, demanded that he get everything back. It all happened because the Archduke decided to combine the attributes of the race, even though the boy had asked him not to. In fact, the boy realized that this was not what he wanted. However, he did not understand why this was happening. During the dialogue, the man found out that the boy loved him, but said that he hated him. In addition, he accused the Lord of starting it all with him. The king came to when he found himself in a rather unfamiliar place and began to ask Ruhak what it all meant. People were walking around them, minding their own business, and behind them, a huge castle was visible. At the same second, he plunged into the memories of his past, when one of the men nervously asked the other why they should take care of that boy instead of sending him to an orphanage. The other man replied that he didn't like it either, but he also noted that no one would take in such an adult child. After that, he went up to Do Se-hyun and asked him why he was glaring at him, calling him a petty person. Another incident happened to a guy on the street when he was alone in front of a bunch of other freaks. One of them took his headphones away from him, scolding him and saying that he was just borrowing them for a while. However, Do Se-hyun said that he did not allow this and had his own explanation. He explained that his mother had not bought them for him, but he had earned them himself, so he was not going to give them away so easily. The man smiled in response, ironically praising the boy for such an adult act. However, he offered to clarify something. He asked him if he had parents who could buy it for him. Then he noticed that the boy didn't even have any friends. The man assumed that he must be going through a hard time, so he was acting out. He also added that this was probably why his parents abandoned him. Do Se-hyun recalled these moments with anger, not understanding whether it was really so unfair and everyone was picking on him. At that time, neither at school nor at home, he did not feel safe. So, as soon as he graduated, he ran away from the place where he had lived before. He found a small but cheap room with everything he needed and began to earn his living on his own. However, one day he was left completely alone, as he had no time to think about his friends and university. When he came home from work, he immediately went to bed and watched something on his phone until nightfall. This went on until one day. Suddenly, Do Se-hyun heard someone's mysterious voice inviting him to play a game together. According to the results of an aptitude test, he was assigned to the angel race, which was considered the weakest. It was impossible to take the test again, so he simply accepted the fact that he was now a subspecies of golden angels. His vassals took on the full brunt of the shame of being the weakest race because of his incompetence. However, they were not just NPCs for him, but the only ones who were on his side, so he became very attached to them. Unlike him, they hoped to become stronger and were willing to do anything for it. However, when Do Se-hyun noticed that Ruhak had smeared his snow-white wings, which are a symbol of the Empire, the man emphasized that he hated him. Returning to the events that took place before that, the boy was in the font, where the Archduke was trying to wash him, which made him very nervous. The man said that there was no one else to do it, although Do Se-hyun began to shout and demand that he be given the opportunity to do it himself. After that, he put on a robe and asked the Archduke where he was and where the people who were with him were. Ruhak was annoyed by such questions, so he said that he had just regained consciousness and was already interested in them. And looking at the Lord's puzzled look, he said that he had saved their lives, as he had been ordered to do. After that, he expressed his concern that the boy did not remember their empire at all. Do Se-hyun looked out of the window and was surprised to realize that this place was indeed very similar to what he had seen on the monitor. Touching the glass with his hands, he emphasized that he hadn't forgotten about her. Ruhak was surprised, however, because he simply walked away, leaving them. He tried to explain why he did this, but could not articulate the reason for this. So he said that even if he told him everything, he would still not be able to understand him correctly. After that, he asked the Archduke why the man had found him, since he could hardly have missed him. He asked if it was not enough for him to be alive. He also confirmed that he had destroyed the Empire with his own hands. However, Ruhak said that he was sorry if he thought it was a punishment, and told him that the unification of attributes would soon be completed. This information surprised the boy, although it reminded him of a day in the life of the Empire. Back then, everyone's race changed and one wing became black. However, his wings did not change, although he really wanted to feel the bitterness of the coming changes. Ruhak said that it would be better for him. At least he would no longer be able to faint from the appearance of his wings. Do Se-hyun emphasized that it was all too easy and asked what would happen if he said he didn't want it to happen. The Archduke asked to let him think about it and said that they could use powerful drugs, and if necessary, they would do so. The boy asked to stop this conversation, but he said that he shouldn't hide his wings, because they were a symbol of the Empire, and everyone should see them. In the end, Do Se-hyun agreed. He said that he would do as he was told, and in return, he asked to be allowed to meet those people. Ruhak was surprised that he listened to him so easily. He explained that otherwise his wings might no longer be considered a symbol of the Empire. The Archduke did not like this statement. He began to shout that the Lord was wrong, because it was only because of these wings that he was still looking after him. He also emphasized that he would not be able to give them up so easily. Do Se-hyun was surprisingly calm and looked him in the eye and said that he could still try to do it. The man was furious and asked the boy if he was threatening him with his wings, feeling a tremor at the slightest touch of them. After calming down a bit, he cautiously pointed out that the Lord's clothes were not yet ready and emphasized that he should not even think about getting out of here. Do Se-hyun jumped out of his seat and began to resent the fact that he could only be here. He tried to stop the Archduke and said that he needed to meet with the people because they were in danger. However, he suddenly fell down because he felt that some strange things were happening to his leg. So he started to examine it. It turned out that he was chained to shackles that held him tightly, preventing him from taking a single step. Ruhak pushed the door open with his hand and finally advised him to sit still until he returned, which shocked the guy even more. No matter how much he begged the Archduke to stop and listen to him, he simply walked out silently and closed the door. Do Se-hyun was depressed. He could not believe that the man could just leave him here, alone, bedridden. Although he hoped that the feeling of longing would be stronger than hatred, and that it was because of this that he had taken him away. He remembered how the man had asked him to prepare for the merger of attributes, and realized that he was still hoping for something. Squinting his eyes, he realized that all he could do was suffer, although he wondered why the man cared about him so much. Resting his head on his knees, he began to think about whether people really behave like this with those they hate. Suddenly he felt a very strange feeling, so the very thought of it only made him feel worse. Do Se-hyun forced himself to come to his senses, because every action Ruhak took made sense, and that was the only way he could continue to be pissed at him. So he decided to start by gaining his trust, although it wasn't easy given his condition. Despite the fact that he was locked in here, he wanted to wait for the attributes to connect, hoping that he would become stronger. He was also worried about whether he could handle the criticism of the residents who accused him of abandoning them if it didn't work out. So, as Ruhak said, he was probably better off staying alone, just like he had been then, which made his heart squeeze even harder. Besides, he was worried about people and nervous about whether they were okay, and what would happen if he never saw them again. However, right now, he did not want to be alone at all. But since he was handcuffed, he couldn't do anything about it. Meanwhile, Jae-yong tried to knock loudly on the door, cursing those who had put them there. Kwak Yong-han yelled at him to calm down and started pulling him away, explaining that someone might actually hear them. While they were arguing with each other, Pak Do-hyun watched, thinking that these two were definitely not brothers, so he didn't understand why they were acting like this. Kim Kap-young sighed heavily and emphasized that they should be happy that they were not in jail yet. Suddenly, Peek Do-hyun began to remember the other guy and realized that he hadn't gotten to his country right away either. In addition, he reacted strangely whenever it came to empires. So this meant only one thing. He was a king whom his people did not expect. And he was also troubled by that archduke. His face seemed to say that he was up to something. Recalling how he behaved, he realized that this was probably not the way to treat a deposed king. Meanwhile, Jae-yong calmed down and asked what they could do if the black-winged man was torturing Do Si-hyun. Kwak Yong-han said that he had heard that if the king dies, his empire will disappear, so he assured him that the boy would be fine. However, Pak Do-hyun added that he was not sure. He noted that the king certainly wouldn't die, but there were many other options for the development of events. At the same time, In Cheon entered Ruhak's office. When the man asked him what happened to the king of the Poison Empire, he bowed and said that he was in prison. After that, he asked the Archduke if he planned to perform the ritual of merging the king today. The man said that only the two of them could open the treasury. He also said that if he needed to prepare anything else, he would do it. However, he was surprised to hear that the Archduke did not have time for this today, and that he had given him another task. He asked him to tell them to prepare more magic stones with the elixir of youth, because that was the only way they would be able to start. Thinking of the boy, Ruhak emphasized that they could not make any small mistakes. Incheon agreed with him, but said that he was curious about something and would like to hear the answer. As soon as the Archduke allowed it, he asked if the Lord would remain chained until the end of the ceremony, and what would happen afterwards. Ruhak said that they had no other way because they could not be sure that he would not disappear again. So he emphasized that they should leave him there until they are sure that he deserves to be there. Incheon clarified that despite this, the guy is the king that everyone has been waiting for a long time. Then, bitterly, he added that it didn't matter why the Lord had left them, because it was enough that they would be able to see him again. So he asked the man if he agreed with him, or if he thought things were different. However, he remained silent. Meanwhile, in the palace, the door to the room opened, and the servants brought clothes and dinner for the boy. Do Se-hyun could barely get up because his knees were hurting badly, and at the same time he heard from Iobel that the Archduke asked to make sure that the Lord had eaten well. These words worried him a little, because he did not believe that the Archduke could be so caring for nothing, and he was sure that he did not want to hear about the hunger strike he had declared, because he had to be alive for his plans. However, suddenly his fork fell from his hand. Iobel was also frightened, although he did not understand what was happening to him, because the food was stuck in his throat and would not go further. It was not the taste of the food. It was as if he had eaten something inedible, and his body did not accept it. The attribute of his race of angels was gold. So, on that day, after their change, everyone in the Empire got black wings, and he was the only one who did not change. So, since all the objects in the game were divided into races, maybe it was his difference, and that's why he couldn't eat now. However, the boy also realized that if he did not eat a single bite, the Archduke would think that he was doing it on purpose. At the same time, another servant ran up to Iobel and began to ask him what was going on. The man said that if the Lord didn't eat, Ruhak would get angry. So she ordered to bring another dish, as this one might not be good. Iobel was frightened and said he would bring something else right away, and asked the Lord if he wanted to change his clothes for the time being. The boy agreed. However, they encountered another problem. Do Se-hyun was bedridden, so it was very difficult to get dressed. Meanwhile, Ruhak told In Cheon that everything was going as it should now, and asked him to make sure that there were no problems. He also added that this way the Lord would be more likely to gain his freedom. So he listened to him. However, during this conversation, someone knocked on the door to his office. He asked who it was and allowed them to enter. A servant appeared before him and apologized for disturbing him. The man asked what brought him to him. Iobel was very scared, as he did not know what the Archduke's reaction would be, but he told him that Do Se-hyun could not eat at all. Ruhak shouted that he had already told them what to do in this case and ordered them to bring him other dishes, and if all else failed, to force him. The man said that they had already tried everything, but he still spat out the food. Meanwhile, Do Se-hyun was lying on the bed in despair. He was so hungry that his stomach even hurt. In addition, his clothes, which were quite uncomfortable, and his wings, which were heavy, made him unable to stand for long periods of time. His thoughts were only about the fact that he hadn't eaten anything since he was locked in that village house. Or maybe the problem was really the race, although in any case, it was simply impossible to remain calm. At that very moment, the Archduke came into the room. He asked if he wanted to make a mess and said that it was quite unexpected. However, the boy replied that he didn't even have the strength to do that. He also added that he probably didn't even care. The man asked if he was starving on purpose to draw his attention to himself. Do Se-hyun replied that he was not a child to behave like that, although in his heart he wanted to cry and scream out of despair. However, the Archduke had another assumption about this. He asked if he wanted to die like that. The boy began to explain that it was true, and promised that if the man let him out, he would definitely eat. He said that he would eat everything the man brought, just to take the shackles off his feet. At the same time, he promised that he would not escape. He also asked to see the people who had escaped. Ruhak called it a good provocation and said that he did not understand the situation he was in. He emphasized that he was mistaken and explained that he had not come here to persuade him to eat something. However, when Do Se-hyun asked him why he had come here, he whispered that regardless of whether he would eat or not, he would have to shove the food into his mouth. So he gave him a choice. Either he would start eating on his own or he would force him to do so. However, he added, looking into Do Se-hyun's wide-open eyes, that there was another way, which he thought was more important than the king himself. He grabbed him by the shoulders and asked him if he wanted to see alive the people he was so eager to meet. The Archduke thought about what to do now and said that he preferred the latter option. So now, no matter how much he said he couldn't eat, Ruhak couldn't believe him. This provocation was pointless. Do Se-hyun realized that it was his mistake, but he still took the apple from the table and began to eat it reluctantly. However, it felt terrible. His eyes were filled with tears, his face was red, and his saliva was just pouring out by itself. Only when he noticed this did the Archduke realize that the boy was not lying to him, so he asked him to stop eating. Despite the fact that Do Se-hyun continued, Ruhak took the apple right out of his mouth and ordered him to spit it out. Meanwhile, Iobel was quickly descending the stairs, trying to catch up with Sonia. At the same time, he asked her to wait for him. Breathing heavily, he asked her if she was taking the laundry to the laundry room. The girl was surprised, so instead, she asked what he was doing here and why he wasn't with the Lord. The man began to tell her, frightened, that the Archduke was in the Lord's room. The girl tried to ask him about it, but Iobel put his hand over her mouth and said that she shouldn't speak so loudly. Sonia was surprised but happy that the Lord they had been waiting for was finally here, and that she was right. Lowering her eyes, she added that none of them were angry with him, although she wondered why the boy had left them. The servant confirmed that this was true, but emphasized that the Archduke should not have kept a man who had just returned imprisoned like this. They both started shouting that if they were in his place, they would not want to stay here either. However, they did not realize that they were already being listened to. Finally, they saw Incheon standing silently behind them, listening intently to their conversation. They were surprised by this, so they started shouting. Then, having calmed down, they said hello. Fortunately for them, the man did not say anything to them, but simply walked by in silence, so the servants finally breathed a sigh of relief. At the same time, the conversation between Do Se-hyun and the Archduke continued. The latter agreed to allow him to leave. In addition, he emphasized that he could date whomever he wanted, although only if he was accompanied by In Cheon. The Lord was puzzled and asked why he had suddenly decided so, since he had said something completely different earlier. The Archduke didn't understand his surprise, so he asked if he wanted him to go with him. Do Se-hyun started shaking his head and asked him not to, explaining that he would rather go with his vassal. In fact, he was very worried that the man had the skill of penetration. Ruhak emphasized that it would be better if he did not plan anything bad. These words meant that he did not guess anything. In addition, the Archduke said that tomorrow there will be a unification of attributes, so Do Si-hyun will be able to apologize to Jae-yong. This was all he really needed, but the problem was not this, but whether In Cheon would listen to him. He had already spoken to Ruhak and received his orders to watch the Lord. Therefore, he was already walking slowly behind the boy. When he felt it, he turned around. In Cheon immediately bowed to him, which made it clear to the Lord that he could hate him as well. So Do Si-hyun explained that whatever he said might sound like an excuse, but he assured them that he didn't leave them because of hatred. He tried to tell them about the true reason for this act, but he was very ashamed and hesitated. The vassal asked him not to continue and said that it did not matter to him why he had disappeared. It was all because the Lord had returned, and that was enough. Do Se-hyun rejoiced like a small child. He touched the vassal's head and said that his name suited him very well, even though he did not remember the previous one. In Cheon agreed with him and reminded him that this name was given to him by the person he loved the most in the world. The Lord took his hand and asked if he could help him. He replied that he could and that he would do anything. The boy asked him to take him to the treasury now, if he believed him. Meanwhile, the Archduke was brought correspondence from the Empire of the Chained. Gernon noted that there were probably people among them who could communicate from a distance. Ruhak picked it up and said that the letter smelled like an animal. This sensation irritated him greatly. However, there was another envelope from the Yadin Cavalry Empire addressed to the venerable lord of the Black Empire, Bahaya. The letter contained an invitation to a solemn banquet to cement friendship and mutual exchange between the two empires. The 10th hero of Bohemia said that since the Lord had returned, he would be able to take part in it this time. The Archduke crumpled up the letter and said that he was not sure, because he had not yet handed over the reins to him. When Gernon asked why he decided so, Ruhak said that the guy hadn't earned his trust and was behaving inadequately so far. He also added, getting excited and suddenly jumping out of his seat, that he had already asked him not to do anything stupid. He ran to the window and jumped out, emphasizing that the treasury had just opened. Gernon did not believe him. He noticed that it could only be opened by him and the Lord, only after agreement. And only after these words did he realize what he meant. At the same time, Do Si-hyun began to rummage through the drawers, trying to find something. He was sure that what he was looking for was right there, and it was indeed. He found a mana potion. He had very little of it, so it was going to come in handy. Suddenly, Do Se-hyun stopped because he realized that it was not the right potion for him. So he tried to concentrate. He had to look quickly because every minute he could be caught. The solution came immediately. He had to start looking in another safe. However, as soon as he touched it, it opened easily. It was obvious that something was really inside. It was an attribute fusion potion, although it was not easy to get. So something was clearly wrong. The boy decided to take it and leave, until he felt a loud explosion with a flash behind him. In the distance, he heard the Archduke shouting that he had already warned him not to do anything stupid. However, as it turned out, those words were not addressed to him, but to In Cheon, whom he grabbed by the neck and began to strangle. The man explained that he would always explain everything to him in a different way, and emphasized that this would not happen again. The Lord was surprised to see such a picture in front of him, but he did not know how to stop Ruhak. After a while, the Archduke calmed down a bit and released his vassal. He bowed and confirmed that it was his fault. The man approached Do Se-hyun and asked him how he was able to open the treasury. The boy said that it opened by itself. He started shouting that he hadn't meant to do anything and explained that he just wanted to take some magic potion. The Archduke grabbed him by the throat and, furious, asked if he had authorized him to do so. Then he pulled him by the arm and emphasized that his walk was over, ordering him to send In Cheon to prison. Du Se-hyun asked him to wait and tried to explain that his vassal had taken him here because he had asked him to. In addition, he wailed that the prison was too much and repeated once again that he had arranged it all. However, the Archduke took him to a room and threw him on the bed, remembering that he had already stabbed him in the back several times. Looking into the boy's frightened eyes, he said that he hadn't changed a bit, then or now, and he didn't like this attitude toward the empire that had taken him in. Pressing him to the pillow, he began to scream, saying that it was the same when he disappeared. At that time, the man was having a dialogue with the boy, where he confessed his love to him, and then just ran away. Du Se-hyun also recalled his response, namely that it was ungodly to stay behind. Ruhak did not expect that his answer was the reason, but he emphasized that it was not only his opinion, but that of the entire empire. He also added that if he asked him to answer honestly, without hiding anything, he should be prepared for that. He also asked if he wanted to hear something else and share what he thought love meant. Du Se-hyun addressed him as Nell and told him that from the very beginning he could not understand what was on his mind. He thought back on his life and imagined how it might have changed if he had lived by someone else's instructions from the beginning. In fact, he had never had a desire to understand a man or to receive his love. He knew that he could not change the situation in any way. If he just admitted his guilt, he would stay alive and at least be better off than he was now. Now, Do Se-hyun realized that he had ruined everything, and if he hadn't done that then, things wouldn't have gone so far. He agreed that Ruhak's every word was true and that he had always been the problem. After that, the Archduke turned around and headed for the exit. The Lord began to ask him why he did not say a word and whether he did not deserve even words of hatred. He really threw them away and ran away. He just got scared and hid, although he was going to come back someday. He also assured me that he never hated them. Du Se-hyun asked me to believe him and said that he could prove it. He opened a bottle of potion and assured them that this time he would not let them down. Ruhak stopped and asked him what he was drinking, although he didn't understand why the man was so surprised. After he drank the potion, he was in great pain, mortally painful. His body was trembling and his wings were breaking out. The Archduke asked him to raise his head and look at him, but he said he could not see anything. Only now did the boy realize the pain he had caused everyone in the empire, so his eyes filled with tears and his heart with longing. In fact, at that time, he was only interested in one thing. Would the suffering have been the same if he had done it earlier? Sometime later, at night, a heavy downpour began. The drops were pounding on the windowsill, trying to wake up the residents. However, it didn't bother Do Se-hyun. He was sleeping so soundly after the pain he had experienced that he didn't hear anything around him. Suddenly, Iobel came into the room and asked the Archduke, who was sitting with the Lord by the bedside, to replace him. The latter replied that he had already told him that no one was to come in and ordered him to leave immediately. The man nervously began to ask if Ruhak needed anything in that case, since he could bring everything. He stroked Do Se-hyun's forehead and asked for some more medicine, as the fever was not going away. Iobel assured him that he would be right there and take everything he needed to alleviate the Lord's serious condition. At the same time, the guy opened his eyes. He was still in pain because the wings were tearing his back, and it was difficult to breathe. However, he was interested in who was sitting next to him. The Archduke asked him not to move and to lie still until he heard a strange address. Du Se-hyun called him Nell again, but this time it did not make the man angry. So he thought it was just a dream. He woke up to sunlight that had filled the room since the morning. He sat up a little on the bed, touched his hair, and immediately felt a sharp pain in his head and blurred eyes. In addition, his whole body felt too heavy. He assumed it was because of the potion and decided to see what was wrong with his wings. However, they retained their color and did not change, so he was surprised that this was even possible after the hellish pain he had experienced. The guy stared at the screen that had just appeared in front of him and could not believe what was happening because he was sure that this time it would work. However, to his surprise, nothing had changed except that he had moved to the third level. Du Se-hyun nervously tried to find an answer until he heard the Archduke's footsteps behind him, who asked what he was grumbling about. He turned around to look at him, but as soon as he turned his head, he felt a sharp pain. This made him fall to the floor, closing his eyes, right on the wings that were hurting him. The man came closer and noticed that the boy was feeling better. He blushed and thought that he was not ready to see him yet. So, getting up from the floor, he asked how long the Archduke had been here. He replied that he hadn't even left and, in turn, asked if the guy knew about it. Du Se-hyun didn't understand why he had dreamed about it at all, but said that he hadn't noticed it. The Archduke grabbed his face with both hands and asked him again how he felt. It was quite strange for the Lord, so he did not understand what was happening. The guy began to make excuses that he was getting better and that everything was slowly getting better. In fact, he was surprised by something else, namely why Ruhak's wings had turned completely black. Du Se-hyun started to get angry and asked the man what he had done and if he was the reason why his wings hadn't changed. He suggested that maybe instead of his wing, he now had the wing of an archduke. The man replied that this was true. The man said that he had absorbed his changes, although he had not planned to do so from the beginning. However, there was no other way out. The Lord tried to ask him why he had done this, and explained that he had deliberately drunk the potion to activate the changes in himself. Ruhak grabbed him by the shirt and said that this was indeed the plan, and that with the help of the magic stone with the elixir of youth, only his race would change, without changes in his body. When the Lord asked why this was supposed to happen, the man explained that if the stone was used together with the elixir, the attribute of race would change, and the changes in the body would be minor and without much pain. However, he added that during his absence, they had studied this method dozens or even hundreds of times, strengthening the most suitable variety of magic stones under optimal conditions. The Archduke explained that they had prepared and waited to ensure that not the slightest change or mistake would occur. Squeezing his shirt even tighter, he added that they were doing all this because his wings must remain white. The man said that this was the only proof that their empire was not a state of dirty half-breeds. Therefore, he asked to keep this feature. Ruhak said that if he had been patient and not drunk it all so recklessly, there would have been no problems. Du Se-hyun began to cry and explained that he just thought that if he didn't drink it himself, he would get angry. After a while, the Lord told the Archduke that he didn't have to treat him well. He began to shout that if he really needed him only as a king, he would not run away and therefore there was no need to worry. Looking at Ruhak, he added that he really did not know how he understood his words that he loved him. However, he noted that he did not mean that he wanted to share everything else with him. He explained that the man could not even hide the irritation on his face and was passing the buck. However, the man suddenly grabbed him by the arm and asked him if he could prove that he wouldn't run away. As soon as Du Se-hyun asked how to do it, the screen popped up again, saying that the right to rule the empire had been activated. The boy was shocked, so he asked the Archduke why he had given him this opportunity back. He replied that he was giving him one last chance. He also added that since he was now a full-fledged lord, he should no longer commit rash acts. In addition, he asked him to get rid of the habit of crying, because they already had enough sycophants. Ruhak emphasized that it would be good if he behaved like a real king, and did not forget that with his death the empire would die. After that, he ordered the boy to change his clothes and told him that they had to go to a place. Du Se-hyun was surprised, but he obeyed the Archduke and meekly went to do what he asked. A few minutes later, they were walking down the corridor of the palace. The Lord was behind and complained that his clothes were very uncomfortable. So he asked the Archduke to walk more slowly, and he wondered if he would ever meet the boys he had met in the village again. Suddenly, he looked up and realized that they were walking in the direction of the prison. Finally, the heavy door opened, and In Cheon appeared in front of him, handcuffed to the wall. Du Se-hyun was puzzled by what was happening there, so he immediately ran up to his vassal and asked him how he was feeling. He asked him to look at him, but he did not respond. So he suspected that it was because the poison had started to spread. The Lord began to shout at the Archduke and reminded him that he had promised him that he would simply be imprisoned. He was shocked that Ruhak could do such a thing after losing control for one day. The man was surprised and emphasized that 4 days had passed since he had taken the medication and lost consciousness. After that, he asked the puzzled boy if he was happy to pay with the blood of the people of his own empire. In fact, Do Se-hyun was shocked by this himself, although he knew that the Black Angels are characterized by strong hostility towards other races. However, even as a thief, he would never do such a thing to his own people. In addition, he realized that no matter how heartless Ruhak was, he could not ignore this characteristic unique to Black Angels. The only thing Viz knew for sure was that the reason he was doing this, not hiding anything, and even giving him the opportunity to regain power in the Empire, was a threat. So, looking at the Archduke, he realized that if you give away power and do unauthorized things yourself, you need to look at all sides so that it does not turn against you. So he ordered In Cheon's immediate release, while trying once again to bring him to his senses. The Archduke nodded his head and ordered Gernon to do what the king had just said. The latter immediately set about doing so. Touching the vassal's hand, Do Se-hyun asked him not to do it again if he did not want his anger. The boy was very angry, emphasizing that this was his race as well. To which the Archduke added that it was also about his servants. Squeezing In Cheon's hand even harder, he confirmed this, realizing that Ruhak already knew everything. He added that he would talk to him about it again. In fact, Do Se-hyun couldn't disobey the Archduke or refuse him, so this complicated things. Meanwhile, the Lord asked Jong-un if he was having a hard time and needed his help. He said that everything was fine. After that, he scratched his head in shame and asked to be called Gernon instead of Genon. The guy smiled and reminded him that it was he who had come up with the name. After that, he emphasized that no one but him had ever called him Janon. They also both recalled how they fought over it with Pen on the training ground, which embarrassed them both. Finally, the 10th hero, Bahaya, said that he had heard that he had not eaten a spoon since his return. He also said that everyone was very worried about this. The Lord smiled and assured him that he would be able to eat now. In return, he asked if he was eating well. Du Se-hyun began to bombard him with questions about whether he was sleeping well, whether he was exercising, and what happened to the seeds he had given Rakwon. The Archduke walked behind him, listening to everything, but chose to remain silent. Finally, they reached the door, where Do Se-hyun asked him to wait a second to open it. He was shocked and assured him that it was not necessary, as he had not yet fully recovered. The Lord felt the Archduke's heavy gaze on his back, but he smiled and said that he was not a child and could do it. The guy pulled on his pen, asking him to tell him if he needed anything. He also emphasized that he wanted to tell him about it, not only to him, but also to everyone when they met. However, he was sad to say that he probably wouldn't be able to do so until he was able to, worried about whether everyone would want to see him. Gernon wanted to argue with him and tell him how the others really felt, but he didn't have time, as the Lord had already seen everything for himself. When he opened the door, he noticed that all the vassals and inhabitants of the empire were kneeling before him. They told him that since his return, everyone had been waiting to meet him. The boy could not believe his eyes. He was so afraid that they would not understand him and would not want to accept him. But here, everything was the opposite. Meanwhile, the servants were busy cleaning the palace. A girl was sweeping the floor and a man was watering the flowers. The man came to a flower bed with some very unusual flowers. However, as soon as he got closer, he heard a loud scream. The girl began to scold him and emphasized that this part could not be watered without permission. When he started to ask why, she explained that this was the flower bed of the hero Rakwan, so he should ask him. The man could hardly contain his laughter, realizing that such a huge and strong vassal was fond of planting flowers. The girl emphasized that she had heard that the Lord himself had given him the seeds of these flowers. So, Rakwan promised to chop the one who touched them with an axe. Suddenly, they heard someone stomping behind them. They turned around and saw a man who ordered them to follow him. He started shouting that the Lord was now in the main square. He said that people were saying that he had regained consciousness, so there was a chance to see him. They were a little confused because they did not know how to react to this, because it was quite unexpected. However, they blushed and began to rejoice, because the king of the empire would finally come out to talk to them. Meanwhile, Jernon also came outside and confirmed to the Lord that everyone was really waiting for him. After saying that, Do Se-hyun immediately decided to go to the crowd, even though the 10th hero of Baekhyun asked him not to. He realized that he was still too weak and might not be able to stand on his feet, which eventually happened. The vassals were shocked to see the king fall, worried about his future life and health. Trying to get up, the Lord said that he was fine and nothing had happened. Finally, he stood up, straightened his clothes, and was ready to communicate with his residents. A man with an eye patch immediately knelt down in front of him and emphasized that they had indeed been waiting for him. The Lord was very happy to hear this, so he asked him to stand up and hugged him tightly. Seeing this, Incheon slowly began to regain consciousness, and a smile appeared on his face. However, everything was not so good. One of the vassals began to shout, asking if this was too much for the Lord. The man began to resent the fact that he was hugging only him and explained that he was second in the ranking. He was also annoyed that Jernon was 10th, although he had met him earlier. So he asked to hug him too, which surprised the people standing around, as no one knew how the king would react to this. But he smiled, extended his hand, and asked him to come closer. The man could not believe his ears and that it could be true. Nevertheless, sobbing, he took steps toward him. Everyone around him could not believe that Do Se-hyun was happy to see them, although they were happy that it was really happening. However, the happiness was short-lived, as suddenly a cry of trouble came from the crowd. The Lord was puzzled, but he began to ask what had happened and what was going on. Barely gasping for air, the man said that airships of a foreign empire were approaching them. He explained that these airships were armed and their weapons were aimed at the castle and the village, which was very dangerous. The Lord began to think about what empire they might be from. He assumed that if they were from Jae-yong or Paik Do-hyun, then there would be no need to fight. The Archduke excitedly stepped forward and ordered Jung-won to destroy them all. Incheon was also ready to fight. He immediately put on his armor and held a weapon in his hands. The boy tried to stop him and emphasized that he was not yet fit to do this work, as poison was spreading through his body. The Lord began to grab his hands and ask the Archduke to do something. However, he advised him to just let the hero go. At the same time, Incheon touched the guy's hand and said that everything was fine. He also added that it was his job to protect the Lord in any situation. After that, Ruhak approached the puzzled Do Se-hyun and emphasized that these 12 warriors were the best, asking why he did not trust them. The Archduke said that it would be hot enough and informed him that they had not taken a single crumb in their mouths since he returned. The guy was confused, not understanding why this happened and what it meant. So Jernon explained that when the king is hungry, the vassals who have sworn allegiance to him cannot fill their stomachs. The Lord was shocked that they hadn't eaten anything for almost a week, and it was all because of him. Clenching his hand into a fist, he wondered how the best warriors and heroes of the entire empire could fight in such a state. Suddenly, however, he remembered that he had taken a magic potion when he was in the treasury. A screen appeared in front of him, showing the amount of mana at his current level. However, it was not enough, even if he tried to use the skill on only one character. Finally, the guy remembered that he had 10 bottles of magic potion and wondered if he could hold out. Finally, opening one of them, he confidently decided that he could do it. Not just for one, but for all of them. At the same time, all the vassals were enveloped in the spell of the magic potion. It spread throughout their bodies and gave them powerful strength. One of the men explained to the heroes that the Lord had given them his protection. He said that now they could not let him down. Do Se-hyun was so excited that his heart was almost jumping out of his chest, which later showed in his symptoms. Sometime later, in his room, a man was holding his hands over the magic ball and muttering to himself. From these strange sounds, the Lord immediately woke up and, horrified, jumped out of his seat, realizing that he had lost consciousness again. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the man trying to hide under the bed, which only made him laugh. He leaned down and asked Muan if he was sure he could really fit under there, advising him to be careful. After that, he grabbed his face with both hands and asked if he was okay and hadn't hit anything. He also remembered the heroes and asked if any of them were injured. The Archduke, who was sitting calmly in his chair, answered this question. Ruhak said that everyone was safe. Suddenly, the Lord heard some noise outside the door. The men were indignant that only Muan was in the king's room. After that, the door could not withstand the pressure of the crowd, and all the heroes found themselves inside without expecting it. They fell to the floor in a heap on top of each other. From below, they could only hear a request that Rakwon, who was the heaviest in their company, be taken off. However, he held out his hand with flowers he had picked from his flower bed, which touched Do Se-hyun deeply. Despite the fact that the Archduke began to scold them for disturbing the king's peace, he came closer and bowed to the heroes. After that, a smile appeared on his face, and he invited the vassals to go with him and have lunch together. At the same time, Jae-yong and Paik Do-hyun couldn't sleep, listening to the terrible snores of Kim Kap-jung and Kwak Jong-han. But in the morning, the boy couldn't get over his joy when he saw Do Se-hyun in their prison. At first, he wanted to tell him how much he missed him, but when he saw the Archduke behind him, he started shouting that the bastard was chasing him. Restraining his emotions, Pak Do-hyun grabbed the guy by the shirt and explained that they were from the same empire and on the same side. He also added that they were not here by invitation, but because they were brought here. He ironically remarked that they were number 1 in the king's ranking, which surprised the Lord himself. So, Jae-yong began to ask why he was hiding it. The king said that they had already asked him about it. However, Paik Do-hyun said he didn't believe it, because the boy didn't look like an angel race, nor did the number 1 king. He started shouting that if you look closely, his race is not angels at all. Jae-yong grabbed his arm and told him to shut up, but he continued. He said that they were the same. Then he pointed to Kwak Jong-han, calling him an amphibian, and to the monkey, emphasizing that they had no empire at all. Jae-yong, in turn, pointed out that he and he had not returned to their empires either, instead hiding in that village. He explained that each of them had different situations, so there was no point in boasting about race and status. Then he asked Pak Do-hyun what kind of empire he really had. The Lord stopped their argument. Do Se-hyun ordered them to stop and told them that he hadn't brought them together to quarrel. Looking at the boys, he asked if the problem was that he hadn't introduced himself right away. Would the matter be closed if he did so now? The guy emphasized that, as Pak Do-hyun had noticed, they were in the Baechia Empire, and its king was Do Se-hyun. He also added that they were not captured. It was just that in the current situation, bringing them here was the best way out. After that, he emphasized that it was because of this that they could decide for themselves what to do next. However, no sooner had he said that it would be better if each of them returned to their empire than Jae Yong began to whimper and ask to stay with him. Kwok Yong Han was also worried, asking what would happen to him and Kim Kap Young since they didn't have an empire at all.